everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our Q&A Cafe, Types of Data Uploads in SAP ByDesign. This will be part 2, Master Data Migration, with your host, Alex Waddell. I'm Catherine, and I'll be facilitating today. If you do have any questions, you can always type them into the questions or the chat box there. And we will answer them towards the end of the presentation. As usual, this meeting will be recorded, so everybody will remain on mute, and then we will send out the recording in our usual email a couple of days after this webinar. Please don't forget to join us next week. That's going to be on Wednesday, May the 5th, for our next Q&A Cafe in Information Lifecycle Management and SAP Business ByDesign. All right, without further ado, I will hand it over to Alex.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's Cafe, which is part 2 of a session we held a few weeks ago, the data migration templates. Just a little bit about me. My name is Alex Waddell, so I'm the Director of Enablement. I work out of our Canadian office, and I've been with VistaView for 14 years. So that's me, gray hair, because I am so wise in all things SAP. Well, maybe not all things, but I know a few things about data migration. So in the last session, we talked about data uploads from the perspective of using an Excel template, which uses the actual ByDesign add-on inside the Excel ribbon bar to upload data. So that's more like a transaction by transaction. So for example, uploading a single journal entry, uploading a single budget could have many, many rows. What we're doing today is more of the backend data migration that's typically used by your consultants to load your data during the initial system configuration. And part of the reason that we wanted to do this session today is because it doesn't always have to be around initial system configuration. So while it does allow for mass uploads of various data sets in the system, those data sets don't need to be exclusively initial system configuration. So if we look down to that 4th bullet point, we may want to modify, or you may want to upload existing data, new data for, say, an acquisition. So perhaps you acquire a new company, and with that, a bunch of new customers, and you want to upload them into the system rather than key them in, then you can absolutely use the same data migration process that we use to configure your system to upload those new customers. You may also use it because you're modifying the way your company works. So for example, maybe you set up a new logistical area inside your supply chain. And as you may know, if you are involved in supply chain, all your material masters have to tie in to that data in order to be used in it. So unlike uploading new customers, maybe what you want to do is an upload or an update type of upload in which you want to modify or augment your existing data. So the data migration does have sort of a logical divide between master data and opening balances. We'll talk about that a little bit, but overall, the process is pretty much the same. And we'll also discuss a little bit about some of the mechanics. We're only going to pick one sample just to walk you through it, but we can talk a little bit about how the mechanics of that could vary depending on the type of data you're loading. So an example I provide is when you're doing the customer load, you might have sort of a data migration decision to make, like whether or not you're going to use your legacy customer numbers or whether you're going to let SAP ByDesign assign new numbers to the system. And that specific variable, mechanical variable, obviously wouldn't exist for every different data migration in the same way. So we'll talk a little bit about those as well. So just a quick sort of overview of the mechanics. You're gonna essentially get your data downloaded somehow from some sort of a legacy system, right? So that company you acquired, if it's your initial migration from whatever legacy accounting system you're in, if it's the example where it's the material master update, maybe it's not really going to come from a legacy system. Maybe in fact, you'll download all of your materials from your existing SAP system. And then once they're in Excel, you'll do sort of a find replace to say, okay, I want to add this new logistical area on every row, and then cut and paste that into the XML template we're going to load. So I'm going to show you where we go to get those XML templates. XML templates that are going to be modified using the Excel tool. Typically, there's a process in there where you're going to cleanse the data. So if you are getting it from some sort of legacy system, chances are you're going through and you're looking for duplicates and things like that. And then ultimately, once you're satisfied with that data cleanse, you're going to take that XML template, you're going to upload it in SAP, and you're going to run through the SAP migration process to get your final data in the system. So where do we go to find the templates? We're going to go into our business configuration, into our implementation projects. This is assuming you still have an active implementation project. If you don't, there's another way to go in and get to these activities. If there are questions around things like that, feel free to drop them in the panel. If it's something that we can't answer easily during this session, we could easily have another Q&A cafe on that area. Here I'm just going to search for the word migration. I could also do a grouping of activity group because these are really broken out in some sort of a migrate or maintain category. And you will see that each one of these options are pretty much implying to you the area that you can upload in. Now, as far as what kind of data migrations can you do, I do have a couple more of those in this PowerPoint, the list. And so once again, I said there's a bit of a logical separation between master data and transactional data. So these are the types of master data elements that you would load into the system, and these are the type of transactional data that you would load into the system. And I'm highlighting this one called migration of accounting transactional data because that one is a little bit different. There's actually multiple migration templates underneath that category. So for example, uploading open payables invoices would be a different template than loading opening bank balances, opening inventories, things like that. But these all roll up under one broader activity, which then tie into a balancing activity that you would do to tie this into your general ledger. So I'm not going to get into that in a ton of details. Once again, if you have specific questions about that, I would be happy to try and address them. So feel free to drop those questions in as we go. So each one of these that say migration of the specific item that you're trying to get into is actually the gateway to launch the upload into the system. And we're going to end in that section. So first, in order to get the template, we're just going to scroll down a little bit here. Going to give you an idea of kind of what's in these sections. But you can see that there's one specific one called prepare for data migration. And that's the one we're going to go into because from this single gateway, we can get to all of the templates. So you will see that inside each of these gateways, there are links to other landing pages, which are primarily instructional in nature. So I'm not going to open these, but if you're curious, you're welcome to go in and explore this. So you could get to a landing page from SAP Help that kind of explains what the process is. I'm just going to go right into the download migration templates, and it's going to launch another browser window, and it's going to take you into something that looks different than what you're used to seeing from SAP ByDesign. And so what you now see is in fact that list of all of those different things that you are able to upload into the system. And for each one of these, you can click on the box, and then you can click on the download button. You could also use the control key, and you could select multiple items like I have here. And if you do that option, then you would download it as a zip file. And that zip file would contain each one of the migration templates you've selected. So either method works. If you scroll down a little way, when you get to the bottom of that list, this is where you get to the transactional data templates. So as I mentioned, and this didn't really show up in the list, but if we get into there, there is this other subcategory called financial accounting. And while I didn't show that in the PowerPoint, this has its own exclusive list. So uploading of bank accounts, GL balances, inventory, goods receipts. So these are a little different than the other ones because these ones have a financial impact. So this is something that it's a lot less likely you're going to ever use these templates once you're up and live in the system, with maybe the possible exception of setting up a new legal entity. So maybe the acquisition scenario where you're migrating in another legal entity and now you have to set up, their opening accounts payable or opening accounts receivables or GL balances. But otherwise, you wouldn't really use those. Now, if I go back to just one of these templates, let's just pick one as a sample to download. Click on the button. If you choose the zip file option and you've grabbed a bunch of these, be prepared to wait for a few minutes. It does take a while for the system to compile that file for the download. And then the other thing you're going to watch for is make sure that you don't have any sort of pop-up block or anything blocked or a download blocker. And then you're going to end up with your template. Now, if you go and double click this XML, you may be lucky. It may actually just launch Excel and open it up. If it doesn't, it could be that your particular PC is not mapped to load XML files. And so you would have to just go through your Windows process to make sure that that particular file extension is mapped to Excel. But failing that, you could always just open Excel first, go to your download folder and find the file. What I'm going to do is switch over to that file where I've already pre-populated some data just to save us some time. So when you open up that XML file for the first time, what you're going to see is these first 7 rows are populated. You're going to see a bunch of tabs across the bottom, but obviously there won't be any data in the white area, which is where you need to populate your specific data that you want to load. Now, one other thing I will add about downloading that XML file is it will have any custom extension fields that you've created in the system. It will have created columns for those. And so those would be available to you as well to populate in the data upload. So that's quite a slick feature. So if you have created some sort of extra field inside your customer table, that would appear here in this list. All right. Now, how does this file work? A couple of hints and tips in here. So the first thing I'll mention is on this introduction tab, well, this is actually usually always blank, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. The general tab is really the main reference table that you're populating. And then all these other tabs have potentially many to one relationships with this main tab, meaning that we would load all of our customers on this general tab, but each customer could have multiple addresses, or they could have no addresses at all. It all depends on your data and how you plan to upload it. So because of that, we need to tie these tabs together through some sort of a key field, and that'll always be in column A. So in this case, it's the account ID, which we are saying is 305 for this particular new customer number 1, not a very original name. But if I go over to the address tab, how do I know that Lemon Road, Albany, New York is related to new customer 1? It's because it's tied together through this particular customer ID. Now, you aren't necessarily required to load an address for every customer. In this particular example, depending on the type of data you're loading, you may or may not be required to populate these tabs. They could be absolutely optional. I'm not going to get into that for every scenario. That's something that you could reach out to us if you're not sure. But a good way to test is to simply go in the application and have a look. And if you've ever manually put a customer in the system, there's actually very little information you have to load to create a customer record. And so essentially the data migration works off that same process. If the user interface doesn't require you to key that information, probably the data migration doesn't as well. And conversely, if the data migration does depend, or sorry, if the user interface does require you to go into that other tab inside SAP and key some additional data, the migration is going to also require it, but you may not realize that until you try to upload the data, and it may throw an error if it's missing. So some of that just comes with practice and experience. So as I move through the tabs here, I'm not going to go through every one, but you can see that I have created a situation here where I have the same customer ID twice, so 305. I've decided to load 2 contacts, so Mr. Smith and Mr. Parker. those two people will be associated with the 305 customer. And then in the case of 306, I've decided not to load a contact at all. So how you create those relationships is derived based on how you base the data inside your Excel template. And once again, if you're not sure what these tabs mean, a good place to go is just directly inside SAP and have a look. So if we go over to our customers, what you're typically going to find, and I will just click on maybe the new corporate account button. So if I were to key a customer in the system and go to my view all tab, you should essentially see tabs lining up with this situation. In this case, there is collaboration and addresses, contact hours, contacts. So a lot of this information that you're seeing here in tabs is how it's lining up in Excel as well. Now, if there is data, for example, a tab you are seeing here where you are not seeing it in the Excel template, there are some situations where there are additional data migration templates that are required to populate that data. So do keep that in mind. I'm going to pop back into our Excel spreadsheet here. So if we go through our Excel template, you'll see there is no financial data tab. That's a different Excel template that would be used after you've loaded all your customers to populate that data. And that's just an example of another complexity where they've broken it out into a second tab because potentially it's a fairly complex many-to-one relationship between your customers. So that's a lot to know and understand. Unfortunately, like I said, that'll just sort of come with experience. Now, a couple other things I will mention about this template. If we were to go all the way over to the right, documentation, nothing on this particular one, but everyone does have this field list. And so this list may give you a bit more information about the field that you're looking at, and they have a gray area that separates the tabs. But what is important about this list is the length. So keep that in mind. You do have maximum sizes on some of your fields in SAP, well, on many of your fields. So for example, this is a common one we run into. Account name is only 40 characters wide. So if you have a customer with an extremely long name, you may have to abbreviate. You may have to decide to put maybe part of their name. Maybe the reason the name is so long is because in your legacy system, you have a doing business as, and you just have it all in one field. So that may be part of the data cleanse process where you're going to have to take that data and split it up into two fields in order for this to work. So this validation does not happen in Excel. It doesn't happen until you go to load the data in the system. And that can be frustrating because you have a decision to make. Are you going to test all your field lengths by writing Excel formulas? Are you going to do things like just load it and then, do error handling on the fly? And we'll talk about that a little bit. One other thing I'll point out on this file, let's go back to our general tab. There's also some hidden information. If we take row 7 and we stretch it, make it a little bit bigger, you can see the length is also here, so you don't necessarily need to go to that tab. And you also get a little bit of a blurb on what that field is about. So if you are unclear on what the field is for, that's the first place I would look. The second place I would look is go back into SAP ByDesign and maybe look at it in context of the system. You could do the help field in SAP. So a few different ways to try and come up with what that might be for. And lastly, what I'll mention is any field that has an asterisk has to have data in it. So this has to be populated. We need to have an account ID. Now, in some cases, we may see fields that have asterisks, but if the tab is not being populated, you don't have to populate the field. So I don't know if that made sense. If nobody understands that, please let me know. But keep that in mind as well. So you don't necessarily have to load a piece of data for everyone, but if you are loading the piece of data, you're going to have to populate all the fields that they've indicated with an asterisk. And also, I don't know why this is, but there are some fields that are mandatory and they don't have an asterisk. Addresses is a really good example of one where it does a lot of validation based on the region you're loading. We're going to see that because I purposely kind of built a couple little errors into my data migration template so that you can see the error handling. And so despite the fact that maybe postal code doesn't have an asterisk on it, I know for a fact that ByDesign will bark at you if you either don't have it or don't have it properly populated. So that is not very consistent. Don't know exactly why that is. So that additional data is available on all those tabs. Maybe one other thing I will mention about this, because you are working in XML, you will find there are things that are not available to you. Like if I try and do a delete row, it's not available to me. That is because XML is not the same as XLS. So it's not fully enabling all of the Excel features inside this template. This can also be a challenge for data migration. So if you are thinking you're going to dump all of your data from your raw data source into here and then cleanse it in here, that might be a little frustrating. You may want to have a spreadsheet in the middle where you do your data cleansing in an XLS format prior to doing it here, because you're going to find if you're trying to sort, if you're trying to delete rows, that doesn't work. I will mention that if you just clear rows, so if I were to take this row and just hit the delete key and make it blank, the data migration does not care that you have blanks. It will just ignore them. So all it is looking for is rows that have data in it. So you could potentially use that instead of the row delete. So just additional things to keep in mind if you're going to do this type of data migration. One other last thing, and I've done this sometimes when I'm desperate, is I will just save this file as an XLS file and then try and reconvert it back to XML. You can do that with your file save as in the system because you have that option. And there's two different XMLs, and I'm pretty sure it's not that one. You're going to want to choose this XML spreadsheet 2003. And I will just tell you that sometimes this is finicky. So somehow, maybe when you're working on it in XLS and you try and convert it back, you may have done something to sort of corrupt the file. Finding how you corrupted it is almost impossible. It's just not worth the effort. So if you do have that issue, don't lose too much sleep about it. I mean, I would just download another XML template. The good news is you've kind of cleaned up the data and you've got it in the format you want. So you could just take the full blocks of data, cut and paste them into another template to upload them. All right, is there anything we can't upload? Yeah, so that list that I showed you, it may not be completely complete because I didn't go and double check, but there are definitely data sets that are not uploadable. So I can give you an example of one. You can't upload business roles in the system. That one just comes to mind because that's frustrating for me that we have to manually key them in. So while there are many, many data sources, most of the master data, there are a few places in the system where you just cannot do a data upload. It's not available to you. So that's one that comes to mind. Tax tables is another one. There's no data upload for tax rate tables. But most of the data that you can get to as a basic user in the system, like customers, suppliers, all the documents, things like that, there is an upload path for that. So once you've got your migration template ready and prepared to load, just take note of where you save it on your local computer or on your network. We're going to pop back into SAP. I'm going to go back into our activity configurations. So let me close out. So this is where I downloaded that template, prepare for data migration. I'm just going to close that. And now I'm going to look for the specific migration for the one that I want to upload, because each of these, as I mentioned before, have their own gateway. So in this case, it's migration of customers. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to take us again into a little additional menu choices. So just like the other one, there are specific landing pages around help and guidance for migrating customer data. I won't open those, but feel free to go and do your own investigation there. The one that you're after to actually do the load is called migrate whatever, fill in the blank, using the migration tools. And just like the other one that created a template download page, it's going to create a data migration page or tab in your browser. And depending on whether or not data has been uploaded before, you will see something like this. So something I really like about the data migration tool is that it keeps track of all your historical data you've loaded. You can see here it's showing us by file. And then down here at the bottom, it's showing us specifically what was in that file, as well as all of our tabs. So all that information is here. If this is the very first time you're loading data into this particular record type, or if somebody came along and purposely removed this, then the screen would be blank. So we are going to do a brand new upload. And when that happens, we want to choose the upload option, and we always go data from migration template. And that's going to invoke a pop-up, and then we're going to go find that folder where your file was. So mine was called customers v2 XML. I'm going to choose that. If you want to put in descriptions or anything, it'll populate that into this little record history. You could put something like that in there. I don't know if there's a limit on that field. We'll see. And then what it's going to do is one sort of really initial quick validation. And it is possible that you could get a rejection right at that point, and it might give you some sort of error handling. So for example, if you in fact selected the wrong migration file, like suppliers instead of customers, so you're either in the wrong data migration tab or you're in the wrong file, you might get an error. So it does a very basic sort of quick check on the file to say, is this the right file at a high level that I can load? And it's got fairly good error handling. So I didn't have an example of this to show you, but you would usually get some sort of message like file not in the correct format, something like that. If as I mentioned, that situation where you maybe accidentally corrupt the file because you've converted to XLS and then back to XML, that's where you might get some sort of file unreadable error. And so at that point, you'll have a decision to make whether you want to just cut and paste that into a clean file. Now, I'm going to choose the one that's obviously not started, and we're going to begin doing a migration on it. So in order to do that, I would click on this execute migration. I will, just before I do that, show you one thing though. So inside this button that says properties, you do have the ability to make one change, and this is an important one. You could say, I want to upload a file that's going to enhance already existing records. I'm not going to show that today. We probably won't have time, but that may be something that people on the call are after. Essentially, it's the exact same process. So if you are, let's say, trying to augment customers you've already loaded, you would be using those same customer IDs that are already in your system, and maybe you're adding new information, new bank accounts, or a new org unit, or changing some customers' names, whatever it is, the data that you're doing, you would just put that changed data into whatever columns you want to impact. You would use the same customer IDs, whatever it is that the system's going to use to tie into the data that already exists. And then you would change the property of this upload to say, I specifically am looking to enhance existing ones versus add new records. I will also point out that this is not available on every single data migration template out there. So depending on whether you see it or not, tells you if it's there. So in our case, we're just going to do the upload existing. So we're going to go ahead with this migration, and and you should always do the step-by-step. It's going to just walk you through, and it's going to do some validation so that you can see when you do have errors, what the problem is and how to correct them. So it goes through a number of steps. The number of steps here is going to be similar, but may change slightly depending on what data you're migrating. Like accounting data has maybe a couple of extra steps. And then we're just going to work our way through the data. So it's done an overall file validation. It hasn't found any significant errors at that point. So once again, if there was some sort of problem in the overall file, we would see now a deeper validation than the previous one. And then each subsequent step just kind of goes a little bit further into what it's validating. And so now what it's doing is it's looking at the various data elements you've loaded in the system. And what you might end up happening is having a few open values where it's saying, well, there's some data in there and I've mapped it to the way the data looks like it should be in ByDesign, but it may want you to confirm that. So for example, if I open up some of these, we can see that in this file, we have populated the country region as CAD, and this is US. But ByDesign doesn't have a concept of CAD. It only has a concept of CA for Canada and US. So how did the system do this mapping? Well, that one is a little bit tricky because I did a test load before to make sure that this would work for this demo. So in order for me to do my testing, I had to already acknowledge this map. So it wasn't really easy for me. I guess I could have inserted another record with a brand new country, but I think you get the idea. So the first time I would have had to go in here, I would have had to actually invoke a pop-up of all the different countries and say, I'm mapping CAD to CA, and then confirm. And then the file will just handle that. So this is field data that is typically anywhere that is a drop down in SAP ByDesign. So if you're entering an address and you get to the country field, it's not a free text field, it's a drop down list. And that's where you're going to see these situations where maybe it's saying, well, what you're providing me as what you believe doesn't quite map my drop down list. And so here you can kind of fix those. And this is a really practical solution for this. You could alternatively delete the file and correct the file, but there's no reason not to really do it this way because it just does a mass sort of conversion and handles that for all subsequent uploads. So that works really well. Now, I also mentioned earlier on when I was showing you that PowerPoint that there are sometimes specific decisions where the mechanics, depending on the file, could change. So there is an example inside the customer one where you have to make a decision. Are you migrating the existing customer numbers, or are you going to get the new ones as SAP assigns them to you? Very important decision because this is going to heavily impact how that data appears in your final system. So a good reason that you really want to test data migrations in a test environment before you just run this in production so you can actually see what it looks like, despite going through all this validation process. Going to move on to the next step. Now it's actually going to validate more specific, essentially all the field data to see if it runs into any problems. So mine is finished, and it tells me that there are some problems in this file. So I mentioned that I purposely dropped a few bugs in the system because I wanted you to see how you could deal with some of this error handling. And you do have a couple of options here. So the error messaging is fairly good. I won't say 100% always. Sometimes the messages are a little bit confusing. Sometimes if you're getting hundreds of errors here, oftentimes when you start reading them, you realize, oh, it's actually the same type of error that I just happen to have replicated across hundreds of rows. So it may be easier just to go back to the Excel file and fix it. So this is where ByDesign gives you a choice. Do you want to fix it here inside the data migration where you've really got the file staged, all the data has been staged based on the Excel data? Or do you want to abort this and go fix it in Excel? And I'm going to show you both options. So if I want to fix it in here, I can click X or edit data source. So it's just bringing up that one row where it says the postal code. This is actually a very common problem we have with US postal codes because US postal codes, some of them start with a 0. And when you are cutting and pasting data from your legacy data, even if you did have that 0 and you paste it in, Excel often treats it as a number, right? You're probably all familiar with that. And suddenly it drops your leading 0. And so in order for that to be fixed in Excel, you have to have like, a single hyphen, in front of it, it treated as text. So little things like that can cause you some fairly big headaches. So in here, no problem, I can type in the leading 0. I can save it. I can say that that's fine. And then I can just move my way down and start fixing it sort of one error at a time. So this error was specifically saying postal codes in Canada need to have a space in the middle. So quite a lot of data masking validation and how data is entered, especially around addresses. So in order to fix that, I have to put in my space. Now, once I've done my fixes, I can go up here and I can repeat my simulation. I can, well, I always just run it in the foreground. I just have 4 records, it won't take long. And while it's working on that, it didn't take long at all, it tells me there's no errors. So at this point, I can continue and I can upload my data. So let's talk about this for 1 second. Because I've decided to fix it in my staging area, I just want to be really abundantly clear about that because it does not fix the Excel template you had. That Excel template has been we have reloaded, it's still saved on your, your local drive. Obviously, it's uploaded a copy of it to ByDesign, but that copy has never been modified. What has been modified is sort of a staging area inside this application, and that's the only place it's been corrected. So if you choose that option, just keep that in mind, because where this comes back to haunt you is if you are doing some sort of a test load, right? If you're going to need to load this data a second or third time, if you're planning on um, doing anything else with that file for subsequent uploads, that error is going to keep happening if you don't correct it in your original file. And maybe that's a non-issue if you're only loading this once and we're saying it's fine, we're going in, we're never going to touch it again. But oftentimes, like for example, in our world as consultants, we're usually loading this data into your test environment. And then in a few months before you go live, we have to reload all of your customers again into your production environment. And potentially the list has grown because you probably have a few new customers, and probably any errors that you had in your legacy data that we cleaned up for you or got cleaned up along the way. If they didn't make it into that some sort of Excel, then that becomes a whole kind of headache around managing that data. So there is another option here. I could decide to just abort this simulation. And I've just gone back to that main screen. So it was version 2. And then what I want to do is I want to go to my actions here, and I just say I want to delete this. I want to just purge this out of my staging area, and as if it never happened. And then I'm going to go back into Excel, and then go to my addresses, and you can see that I could then fix it here. So like I mentioned before, in order to have a leading zero, you're going to have like a single quote so that it reads it as text. Here we needed a space. And then I'm going to hit my save button. We're going to go back to SAP, and we're going to start this all over again. So exact same file. I decided not to rename it with a new name. That's up to you how you want to manage your data. And we're kind of back where we started here. I'm going to do the same steps, execute migration step by step. And what you will find if you've uploaded the Excel file, like if you've gone through these first steps, you've done the mapping for your converted data, like for your drop-down lists, this step is very quick the next time around because it remembers all the stuff that you did, kind of like you saw with me. So it remembered that my CAD gets mapped to CA. And so it doesn't make me do these things again. And this time when I go to my simulate, it is going to run the simulation through all of those records again. This step could take a significant amount of time if you are loading, thousands or tens of thousands of records. So be prepared for that. And in this case, it's telling me there's no errors because obviously I fixed the problem in Excel. So 2 different approaches, they get me to the exact same space, but just an important thing to keep in mind, okay? I see another question from the group. If errors were found during the second validation, do you have to go change the original file and reload it again? So I think that's kind of what I've been answering the last few minutes. So yeah, once again, those 2 options, changing it there, changing it in the file. But if you are going to reload that file at a later date, my advice is change it in the file. Then you've got a nice clean file. So totally up to you. Thank you for the question. And I will keep an eye on these questions to answer them sooner. Okay, next, execute import. So now it's getting to kind of the final stage. You're going to import the data and you're getting to the point of no return. So it's saying this is, and depending on the type of data you're loading, deletion is very likely not possible, right? So I'm going to say I want to import. So you got to sign your life away with that checkbox. I'm going to say yes. And now it's actually going to run it on your production environment. Can you load accounting data with different effective dates? That is a tricky question. So accounting data, there is a setting in the system for your go live date, and it's going to load all of your accounting data, like your opening balances, your GL accounts, as of that date. You cannot control that within the file. Everything that you do as accounting data migration is based on that date. However, that date that you are setting in your system settings can be changed per legal entity. So if your question is around your migrating a new company into your system at some point in the future and you want to load new accounting data for that company, then the answer is yes, absolutely. But if your question is, can I go now today after I've been live for 6 months and load new open accounts payables as of this month? No, you cannot do that. Okay, so it's told us it's finished. I'm going to hit the finish button and we get the confirmation. And really that just closes us off. So it does take us back to here. And you can see there's a filter here. I don't know why our V1 is not set as completed. Maybe that, oh yeah, it was never done to the final migration. So I can just say I want to see all files. And here's where you can see all of the different files. I should have shown you this earlier. So this was the big work that was done in this environment to load 526 customers at some time ago. But that's how you go to see all of your historical data loads. And you can just grow this list forever. Great tool for augmenting your data, as your needs change down the road. Let's just do a quick verification. So I'm going to go back. In this step, not mandatory, but highly recommended. So you've just loaded all this data. What we definitely want to do is go into our accounts and just see if it's there. So accounts created in the last 31 days. So there's a few other manual accounts that have been created here, but you can see, there we go. New customer 1, new customer 2, new customer 3, new customer 4. So let's go into one of these. And it's a good idea just to spot check. I can't think of a time I've ever gone in here and found something different than the data I've loaded. I can think of times where I've gone in and realized maybe I didn't populate the template right, and I loaded something in the wrong spot. So that could be a potential issue. So I'm going to go into my contacts. So you can see here, this is the one where I said that one customer, I wanted to load 2 contacts to that same customer. And so it's successfully done that. It's created kind of that many-to-one relationship. So all of that is available to you in the system. If you load something using that setting where I said you're going to use SAP's new number versus SAP's old number, you can see that the old number doesn't appear here. So I think we loaded those records as 301, 302, 303, something like that. I chose the option to override it with this number. Just so you know, that original number is hidden in the system. So if you do want to do additional augmentation loads on it, you can use that legacy number. Same thing if you're loading related records like OpenAR invoices, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because we probably downloaded your legacy customers from your legacy system with legacy numbers. We're going to let SAP create all new numbers. But then when you download all your OpenAR invoices, you don't know what those new SAP numbers are. So we just load them with your legacy numbers and the system handles that. So that's kind of a cool feature. You just need to know the mechanics of that, how that works. Trevor's asking one question about the data migration templates and hidden columns. I forgot to mention that. So you are seeing that there are some hidden columns here. So what SAP does automatically is they kind of hide columns that they don't think you use very often, and they give them a different color. So you can absolutely go in here and you can unhide. It doesn't matter whether they're hidden or shown. It only matters whether you populate data inside them when you do the data migration. So if there are fields that you're seeing inside the user interface, but you're not seeing them on the template, the first thing you want to do is come in here and check for hidden columns. Chances are it's here. It's just so rarely used that SAP has decided to reduce some clutter on the screen for you. All right, so with that, I don't see any other questions. I will pass it back to Catherine.
Awesome, thanks, Alex. Another huge thank you to Alex for hosting today. That was fantastic as per usual. Again, just a reminder that we'll be sending out the recording within a couple of days as per usual. And don't forget to join us next week on Wednesday, May the 5th for our information lifecycle management and SAP Business by Design. Thanks again to Alex. Thanks again to everybody who attended, and we'll see you next week.